He implies that those traditional styles cannot be reproduced again. That's not the point. Yes, you can reproduce it, but what is the point? It's literally just, it's just a reified image. It is just a LARP pastiche of the past. It does not speak to our own time period. It speaks to us historically where we come from. But in terms of art that services the needs of people in the present, it doesn't speak to us. I hate to say it.
In my previous 2 videos on art, I argued for a very simple yet important point, which was that one of the many great things about art is not that it is merely able to connect to something deep within us, but that it can also alleviate our spirits higher. However, for this 3rd video, the focus will be less so on the great artists behind these works of art and more so on the artistic work itself, as well as on the people observing these finished masterpieces. In other words, it would be on the relationship between the art and the culture at large. Essentially, it is not merely the greatness of the artist himself that makes a painting or sculpture stand tall. There must also be a very creative relationship between the work of art and members of society. In other words, as important as the genius of the artist is, it is just as much on the people to have a sense of appreciation for art in the first place, for art cannot stand the test of time if it cannot first stand atop the consciousness of the people. For when it comes to everlasting artworks, the artist itself is arguably only half the equation, and perhaps amounting to nothing if it is not appreciated by members of society for generations to come. And so, the responsibility is on the people just as it is on the artist, for we must not only be able to relate to the beautiful and the enchanting, in fact, we as a cultural force must cultivate ourselves to foster and develop this kind of art in the first place. This video will therefore be all about a call for the people to recognize, appreciate, and eventually create. For just as a tree that falls without being heard can be argued as having never fallen, when we as a people fail to make sure that our highest instincts are expressed through art, the argument will go that it was never painted in the first place. And because of this, what is needed is the bridge within us that is able to allow our spirits to cross into the world of ideals. High above the landscape of everyday life, there lies in the heavens above us our highest aspirations, and it is art that shall take us there. At the risk of oversimplifying human history, a criminally brief outline of man's relation to art is necessary. At the turn of the Industrial Revolution, efficiency truly replaced beauty. In the capitalist world, art that takes time and effort became unprofitable. We therefore entered an age of mass production, ready-made products, buildings, and cities. An emphasis on utility has given rise to the lifeless suburban houses, which is an extension of the overall atrocious phenomenon known as modern architecture. For it is here in the urban city centers where glass buildings of monotonous and lifeless office towers stand amongst each other. Inside these walls there lies an assortment of cubicles, every one of them occupied by men and women in suits punching in numbers on an Excel sheet. And it is near the water cooler in the break room that workers congregate to complain about their mundane middle-class lives to pass the time before eventually going back to their cubicles in order to continue working on their Excel sheets. For many workers in society, the concept of alienation seems to be prevalent. Now Marx would claim that this was a result of feeling as if one's work had no direct positive impact on the society around him, thereby embedding within him a sense of pointlessness and apathy towards his job. However, another way of conceptualizing alienation is to understand it as a detachment from the wider historical and societal context that one just so happens to live in. It is as if there is a sense of quite literally being alienated from the overall surroundings that one originally thought he belonged to. In some sense, this can crudely be described as spiritual homelessness. For all the material wealth one may have, they do not constitute a meaning that elevates the possessor to a higher sense of self that feels connected to the society around him. At a very intuitive level, alienation may very well be defined as a feeling of not being part of the time and place that he lives in. A possible cause for this may be derived from the fact that alienation could very well be a sense that there is no cultural narrative that one feels to be a part of. The urban landscape, with its monotone buildings and modern cities, serves no purpose other than to sustain itself through the accumulation of wealth. These buildings, fit for a cosmopolitan neoliberal society, are not built with the intention of cultivating within the person a deep, enriching sense of meaningfulness and belonging. And it was this sense of meaningfulness and belonging that was once so sought after in art, precisely because art that engaged in expressing this cultural connection was often a manifestation of a civilization's highest ideals. It was through the works of art that the essence of a culture, which is to say the mission of a civilization, could be expressed. Walking through the streets of England in the Victorian era, for instance, with its distinct walkways and buildings, one knew exactly where he was. However, where are we now? Where are we today, and do we as a people know? Or are we as a people disintegrating spiritually in a form of a cultural existential crisis? The times, the people, and their highest ideals were once encapsulated in a work of art. It was through art that the story of a civilization was told, so what story would contemporary art tell today, if any at all? One must understand that it was not art that had failed us, but in fact we who have failed art. In giving up the struggle to sublimate our highest ideals into works of art, art in turn naturally reflected our lowest impulses. In a very real way, art is a mirror that reflects the current state of our cultural spirit. One look into this mirror will tell us all that we need to know when one complains about feeling like a cog in a machine. And it will become clear as to why this sense of being a mere cog is in fact not just a physical problem, but also very much a spiritual form of dehumanization. When the flesh is relegated to mundane tasks and our spirits are suppressed, a spiritual crisis becomes inevitable. And thus, by failing art, we have very much failed ourselves. Our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of where we are, and where we belong to in the metaphysical sense of the word, is therefore quite literally at stake. Economic prosperity has come at the cost of cultural poverty, and such a tragic society will no longer be able to enrich itself spiritually. And yet, at the very same time, that is precisely what is needed in order to free us from a cultural sense of meaninglessness. When it comes to the actual art itself, it must be noted that this video is not a statement on what counts as art, or what counts as good art. In fact, art in this context is a means, the spiritual house of a society being the end goal. Therefore, the goodness of art is taken for granted, for it is besides the point. With that being said, on the one hand, in today's society, we have examples of postmodern contemporary art, which exists without context or precedent. And on the other hand, we have those stuck in the past, unable to move beyond the present itself. And this is where Junger's appreciation of history becomes important. An artist needs to be connected to history in order to find sympathy for the whole of humanity and the human condition which has brought us here in the first place. Otherwise, he is damned to attract only the urban cosmopolitan bugman who treads this earth as a rootless creature disconnected from even himself, identifying only with the negation of all common identity. And we in turn must seek in artists great works that speaks to our existential struggles, that calls upon our ideals. For an artist is someone that taps into the consciousness of humanity as a whole through a particularity which is universal to all people, be it Schopenhauer's will to live or Nietzsche's will to power. We must demand of them to elevate the consciousness of our civilization higher, and in turn we must demand ourselves to embrace these very artists. And we too must cultivate an understanding of the past so that we can appreciate the artists who paint for the future. And so the responsibility is very much on us to cultivate a sense of aesthetics in order to bring about art that reflects our ideals in the first place. The future becomes clear to those who study the past, and when we do so, art that speaks of the future becomes all the more clear. In this respect, the forging of our future destiny is done by respecting the destinies that have come before us in history. The future is created through the understanding of how mankind has thus far lived through the centuries, and it is through such foundations that we are able to in turn give birth to a new generation of aesthetics, one that speaks to us today. However, there is more to it than the mere fact of learning history to create a missiles oriented for the future. Yes, the construction of identity is important, but equally important is the creation of art that is identifiable in the first place, something that speaks to us today in our own time, with the problems that we have today. Once again, as Gio from Giant Art Productions so eloquently said in the introduction to this video,
it is just a LARP pastiche of the past. It does not speak to our own time period. It speaks to us historically where we come from, but in terms of art that services the needs of people in the present, it doesn't speak to us. I hate to say it.
The essential crux of the matter here is the necessity of art that seeks to understand the modern conditions that we live in. Whether it be art that critiques modernity, or whether it be art that celebrates modernity. Whatever the case, for art to speak to us today, it must in some way question where we are heading and perhaps even answer where we ought to go. Just as one learns more of the enemy the deeper the knife is stabbed into his body, the kind of art that is needed here is the very blade that tears through the fabric of modernity. The deeper one goes, the more the arteries and organs of our current conditions are exposed. One example of this is the relatively recent phenomenon of so-called literally me movies. These are movies that usually express similar themes and motifs of male loneliness, existential dread, and loss of purpose in an ever-materialistic consumeristic world. But most importantly, they stab right through the heart of our everyday lives. They have gotten the label literally me, supposedly because people would identify with the characters portrayed. Hence leading to a trend in pop culture by which the audience would say that these protagonists are literally me. These literally me tropes in movies is a great example of art that speaks to our own times because it is always so identifiable. If it wasn't, then they would not be called literally me movies to begin with. It is important to note that this is not a legal term. It is not a term you would most likely find in the dictionary. If you do, then it is probably because either it is the Urban Dictionary or the dictionary itself was written much after this video was published. Essentially, it is an organically made term created by the people. This is important because it is further proof that it speaks to our own times, for it is the very people of these times that coined the terms to describe the movies that they so identified with. Much like how ordinary fans of Eminem made a word out of the song title Stan, the term literally me is quite literally a spontaneous phenomenon born within the internet, where ordinary people have said it enough times for it to slowly catch on in popular culture. This in turn harkens back to the point made throughout the video in which I stated that the work of art amounts to something more by being appreciated by members of society for generations to come. And this also shows the importance of having that creative relationship between the work of art and members of society. This is especially true for movies like Taxi Driver, for it is a movie that was made half a century ago, only to become something so identified with by audiences even of today's generation. For this great work of art was able to inspire that very creative relationship, which in turn has allowed the movie to become cemented as a classic film. Even with more recent films such as American Psycho, Fight Club, or even Blade Runner, in every single one of these examples, despite their differences in plot, they all demonstrate and show a deep understanding of the concept of societal alienation and therefore become works of art that do in fact speak to our own time. Speaking of movies, another instance of art that contends with modernity, which is to say art that seeks to understand the conditions that we live in, is a trend noticeable in many Japanese movies and TV shows. This one is a bit broader of a phenomenon than literally me movies, for these films transcend genre. If you ever watch enough Japanese fictional media, you would know then that with few exceptions, the settings usually revolve around one of 5 different environments. High school, corporate office cubicles, World War II, the feudal/samurai era, and the Yakuza. This is important because these are the 5 environments that are so consistent in the cultural consciousness of the Japanese society. Now, what's even more interesting is that despite the large scope and diversity of settings that these environments compose of, there seems to be a common occurrence, at least in the fictional media made after 1945, which is the trope of contending with changes on a societal level, especially in the form of changes via modernization. These changes often tend to leave the protagonist behind, and the changes themselves tend to be in a way that's moving forward. Seldom does it regress to a more familiar time. In fact, it moves into the unfamiliar future, and the protagonist is left feeling lost, out of place and out of time. This again may not be exclusively a Japanese phenomenon. However, Japanese fictional media can be found to often revolve around this trope. When it comes to the movies and TV shows found here in the West, some notable differences is that the changes, if there is one, is often something that directly drags the protagonist along and only indirectly impacts the society around him. In fact, in these Western examples, the change is much more graspable and personal. This means that the change is often only indirectly affecting society at large instead of directly. A very common example of this are superhero movies. The change is very personal, and the protagonist is forced to reckon with these new superpowers. Therefore, many shows in the West demonstrate that the protagonists are forced to change, while many stories in Japan revolve around characters who are quite literally unable to change and adapt. The changes that the Japanese characters see is often much more distant and beyond their reach, and is therefore, much like the omnipresent nature of institutions and laws, the system itself cannot be seen, and yet their effects on the characters is all the more noticeable. Examples include the TV show Serial Experience Lane, as well as various Kurosawa films. More recent films such as Yakuza and The Family, released in 2021, tells of a Yakuza ex-convict who has to adapt to a changed Japan after 14 years in prison. In the Serial Experience Lane, the protagonist of the same name must contend with a new world within cyberspace as she makes sense of a suicide that occurred in the real world. In all of these examples, the change is omnipresent. It is neither tangible or within one's grasp. It is all around you, yet you cannot see it. You can only see the effects of it as the world revolves around its gravitational force. I bring these examples up because I don't think it's an accident that Japanese stories depict the struggles of assimilating into modernity, for that has been the story of Japan ever since the Meiji Restoration, and it was a story that has not only been brought to life in the movies and TV series, but also in literature. Just as Yukio Mishima talked of the satyr who fell from grace with the sea, and just as Osamu Dazai talked about feeling as if he was disqualified from being a person, or to put it another way, feeling as if he was no longer human. It is often the case that these Japanese stories will imply a time when the characters was very much in their prime, where they confidently strode along in a world familiar and home to him, only to suddenly be forced to reckon with a change in society. These stories tend to depict the ways in which one is forced to discard the traditions that have provided a sense of meaning for so long, all because the long-standing customs are now seen as barriers for a new modern society. This trope, so common in Japanese stories, ultimately leaves the characters alien to a society that they have always lived in, as if they have suddenly become outsiders of their own home. I bring these examples of literally me movies and Japanese stories because it is these kinds of art that I think is crucial in the modern era, for it is these kinds of stories that struggles to speak of our own times. As stated earlier, art quite literally serves as a metaphysical mirror, reflecting back onto us our abstract identity. Just as a physical real mirror can show us what we look like, the mirror of art can show us who we are. We know that art can serve as a means of expressing the unspoken workings of the soul, just as it can serve as a means of lifting man's spirit. So it follows that perhaps in an age of such mechanization, in the midst of a generation of office workers stuck in their cubicles, art may allow us to find within us a longing for something higher than ourselves. Perhaps just as art can tell us the ways in which we struggle to contend with modern life, it can also show us the ways in which we can overcome these very real struggles in the first place. With just a little push, perhaps art can once again inspire us to become enchanted by the beauty that have come before us, so that we can once again capture the imagination of the generations set to come after us. In this sense, a key role of art is to connect us to the wider societal context that we live in. Not only does it construct the cultural definition of the community that one inhabits, art very much affirms a sense of belonging and a sense of who we can become. And this sense of belonging and becoming is all the more important in this day and age, for the accessibility of art has become almost infinite, for it is now more accessible than ever in different forms. Today, we can have the Mona Lisa on our phones, on our bedroom wall, and on our computer screens. And because the context from which it was born in has changed, it can be argued that the art itself has changed, bringing us along for the ride. Given that the medium has now become the message, the ways in which we are influenced by art has become all the more complex. And because art has multiplied to infinity, so too has the potential for fragmenting the imagination of the people. The kingdom has therefore splintered, the Tower of Babel has been destroyed, and as a consequence, in terms of aesthetics, we speak different languages. As the mirror that was art has shattered into a million pieces, art that captures the imagination of the people becomes all the more important for us if we are to make sense of this 21st century dream of mirrors. Throughout history, aesthetics was in some ways a cultural crucible, and it must once again, now more than ever, become the crux of our lives again, to give us direction and to give us purpose. Just as the king is a physical embodiment of the nation, so too is art a physical embodiment of the meaning of life. It is therefore up to the poets and the writers, the painters and the sculptors, the musicians and dancers, the actors and the playwrights to construct a cultural destiny, a story for society to follow in the footsteps of a higher calling. In a society where the doctors, lawyers, and engineers keep the world moving, it is up to the artist to make sure that the world moves towards the heavens. But as mentioned before in the beginning of this video, it is up to the people to make sure that we are moved in the first place. It is up to both the artists and the people as a whole to declare and follow through with the aesthetic ideals of the human condition. And so it follows that art shall immortalize the spirit and souls of our cultures.